Welcome. You served 6 presidents, great career in the CIA since 1980, head of counterterrorism, as well as the director of Central Intelligence, and a great nonpartisan voice in America. I want to start with something you said, which is we have no consensus on the role of government when it comes to cyber realms. Explain what you meant and what should be the consensus.
Well, that digital domain has profoundly changed our lives across so many different spectrum, from political, economic, informational, commerce, trade, business. That is the environment where most human activity, I believe, is taking place today. And unlike on terra firma, where you know what the role of the police officer is or FBI or whatever, in that digital environment, there's still a lack of consensus in my mind about what the government's presence should be and authority should be in terms of monitoring activity there.
So you were around when a cyber attack starts to hit Sony. You all would have had a doctrine if it had been a missile attack hitting. What happened?
Well, first of all, the thing about a missile attack, there is a return address from it. You know where error is coming from. With an attack in a digital environment, whether it is theft of IPR or information or a disabling or destructive attack, you really need to understand exactly what's the attribution there. And it takes some time to be confident that you know where it comes from. And then you have to make the determination about what was the significance of the attack, because all these attacks are very unique. And during the Obama administration, the 4 years, and when I was at the White House and then 4 years at CIA, we really tried to define what the doctrine would be. What would be the threshold for an attack against the private sector that would generate some type of U.S. government response, which could range from kinetic to asymmetric, sanctions, whatever else. And then
let me suggest one threshold: meddling in our election. Why didn't you all do something?
Talk about a sui generis phenomenon that took place. It was an ongoing election where there was concern that the Russians were going to continue this effort. We came across it in the spring of last year. We're trying to monitor what they were doing, trying to prevent them from doing more destructive efforts. We wanted to really have a better sense of the range of things that they might do, because we've seen them involve themselves in European elections for many, many years and around the globe. And it's not just in the digital environment and the cyber environment. A lot of active measures that go on as far as propaganda and false reports that go out. So we were trying to, as intelligence officers, we were trying to make sure we had insight into what they had done, what they were planning to do, as well as what their strategy was.
So wait, you said spring. It's actually probably right at the beginning of June is when you start convening people, I've read. Is that right? That's when did you first find out?
Well, I'm not going to say exactly the date and time, but it was in the spring we became aware, and then in the summer months is when it started to come together, and it was clear to me and to others that this was a campaign that was authorized by Mr. Putin, had multiple dimensions to it, and we needed to make sure that the FBI, NSA, CIA were going to be working as close together as possible.
How would you know that it was authorized by him personally?
Well, we have ways. I mean, that's what intelligence professionals do, is to make sure that we understand, capabilities, activities, but also some of the motivations as well as who authorizes it. Something like this in particular, where Russia was going to be engaged in a U.S. presidential election, that has great significance. And certainly I would think, and it is our assessment, as well as information we have, that Mr. Putin authorized something of that significance.
And this is around June, at least we know that you convene interagency groups, right? Do you know at that point which American citizens might be meeting with Russians? There's a June 9th meeting, for example, with Donald Trump Jr. that's caused a lot of news recently. Would that be something the intelligence community would put together?
Well, the CIA and the NSA have foreign intelligence authorities and responsibilities, and so we collect information against foreign actors, whether they be nation states or people. In the process of collecting that foreign intelligence, if we happen upon information related to U.S. persons or entities, it's called incidental collection, we share that immediately with the FBI. The FBI has the legal authority to pull those threads and investigative leads. And so through the course of this ongoing collection effort by part of the CIA, NSA, and others, as we happened upon information about U.S. persons, entities, those associated with the campaign or not, we would immediately share it with the FBI, and then they would take it and do further
And they would share with you the other way, meaning
Well, one of the reasons why I put together a fusion cell of CIA, FBI, and NSA officers is because I didn't want to have walls between those agencies so that there would be a very small group that could share the most sensitive information, which is what happened. And so within that environment, very sensitive intelligence information, investigative information was shared so that the experts could put those proverbial dots together.
Well, speaking of dots, I mean, I'd love to just go a little bit through that month of June. The meeting is June 9th. You haven't really said, you know, personally what you knew, but obviously there's an interagency force. June 13th is when CrowdStrike happens. Explain what that is, and is that when you saw some dots being connected?
Well, it's when there was clear evidence that the DNC and the DCCC were hacked and that emails were then taken and were released. And so then it became a very public matter whereby at least those entities were invaded by some actors. The FBI right away was on it. CrowdStrike was the cybersecurity firm that was working with the Democrats to protect their networks and systems. But again, the CIA was not going to engage with any of those domestic private sector actors or the Democratic or Republican parties. Again, it's the FBI taking our information and other information that would be the conduit for alerting them about some activities that are going on and also giving them some heads up about the steps that they should take to protect their systems.
Would it be fair to say, though, that that's around the time period where you went from being concerned to being alarmed that something really was happening?
I became very alarmed in the summer months, yes.
And what did you do? You went to the, I mean, I've read, I don't know if it's true, went to the White House like with a sealed envelope and secret meetings.
Well, I'm not going to confirm anything that might be in the press, but one of my main responsibilities if I am alarmed about something of national security significance is to make sure that the president and national security principles are aware of that, which is what I did. At the same time, I wanted to make sure that I was able to inform the congressional leadership. And so there is something called the Gang of Eight, which is the leadership of both the House and the Senate. And I wanted to personally brief them for two reasons. One is to underscore the significance of it, because when the director of CIA goes down and briefs them personally, it should send some alarm bells off. But secondly, as you can imagine, CIA, NSA, and FBI have some very sensitive collection systems and assets that are at risk. And I wanted to keep this as closed as possible because we needed to continue to rely on those collection systems and assets in order to give us continued insight into it. So, starting in the summer months and then going into the fall, we were trying to really race against the clock to see what we could do to uncover and therefore have the ability to thwart any additional actions on the part of the Russians, which is why I spoke to one of my principal counterpart in Russia, who's the head of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, on August 4th. And I told him in no uncertain terms, you go down this road, it's going to impair relations between the United States and Russia for many, many years. American citizens are going to be outraged, even if you're trying to promote the prospects of a candidate that they support, because American citizens take very seriously one of the principal pillars of our democracy, which is a fair and free electoral process here. And I guess, in some respects, as we were talking before, I may have been wrong in some of my analysis that I share with Bortnikov, because it seems as though some Americans are not as outraged as
yeah, you
I
said
thought
it would be unanimous. When you went to Capitol Hill and the Gang of Eight, there wasn't unanimity.
There was a range of reaction. One is that they wanted to understand exactly what we knew and how we knew it, very understandable considerations and concerns. I walked them through it. And as you know, partisan waters run deep in Washington, including in the Congress.
But didn't that surprise you that there was a partisan reaction when Russia is meddling in the election system?
It surprised me that there was not more deep interest in this and taking the word of the intelligence community and doing something about it then. I thought that sometimes partisan considerations overshadowed the national security concerns that should have been evident.
In retrospect, should you have been more public about it?
It was quite known publicly about the hacks and how Russia was being pointed to as the culprit there. It was known that President Obama approached and confronted President Putin in September. Jim Clapper and Jay Johnson came out with a public statement in October. Those discussions that we had, we really were almost between a rock and a hard place. One of the candidates who's running the presidential election said that it was unclear whether or not he was going to accept the outcome of that election. And so if President Obama and the Obama administration came out more publicly saying that the Russians are really trying to advance the prospects of the Republican candidate, and that is by the titular head of the Democratic Party in the White House, I'm sure that that would not have gone over very well. So I think what they were trying to do, the policymakers, is really balance what it is that we could do to stop and frustrate Russian efforts, make it very clear to them that this is very serious and they're going to be held to account. But also, folks knew that the Obama administration was going to sunset on January 20th. So the decisions that were made to PNG 35 intelligence officers of Russia, close those dachas down and do some things with sanctions, that was a reaction not just to what they did in the election, but their series of harassing acts against...
Wait, this is the crime of the century, some have said, and you actually kind of agree with that, right? In some ways, a cybercrime trying to hack into our election system. And you're talking about PNGing a few Russian officials. What other options could there have been, in theory?
Well, you know, in terms of cyber doctrine, what you can do is to have a symmetric cyber strike.
In other words, release all of Putin's financial records?
Yeah, maybe. There are things that you can do, but the consideration is that going to be purely punitive and is going to lead into an escalatory cycle in the middle of a presidential campaign, and then it gets worse, and then the Russians do more, which really calls into question the credibility and integrity of the election in November. And so we're trying to do everything possible to stop them, but not allow it to be a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of what the Russians were trying to accomplish. Their first objective was to undermine the credibility and integrity of the U.S. electoral process. Clearly, that has been done. They were trying to damage Hillary Clinton. They thought she was going to be elected. They wanted her bloodied by the time she was going to be inaugurated. And they were also trying to promote the prospects of Mr. Trump because they felt as though they could work more effectively with Mr. Trump.
You know all of that from intelligence means, not just from...
Yeah, as an intelligence professional, we were very, very careful to make sure that we looked at all of the information we had at hand during this period of time, putting it against our wealth of knowledge about how Russian intelligence services, Mr. Putin, operates. And that's why we had such high confidence judgments in these assessments.
And the candidate you mentioned, now President Trump, said there was no communication whatever with the Russians between his campaign. You knew that at the time when he said it, that was false?
He said things, I knew things. I'm not going to pulse one against the other.
And were you somewhat, what was your reaction when he said it was a great honor to meet with Putin a week or so ago?
Well, I felt that this was his first meeting with Mr. Putin while he was, after his election. And here is the person who assaulted our democratic process, our election here, who invaded Ukraine, flouted international law, annexed Crimea, and has done so many things over the years, has suppressed opposition within Russia, has been responsible, I think, for the deaths of individuals who are opposed to his regime. And to say in that first meeting, before they had the bilateral meeting, that it's a great honor to meet him, it made my blood boil a bit, and that's why I decided to say that I thought it was a very dishonorable thing.
And do you think that he has undermined the intelligence community by questioning the assessments you just gave us?
Well, he certainly hasn't given them a lot of confidence that he takes what they say seriously. He keeps pointing out some mistakes that the intelligence community made in the past, like the Iraq W&D assessment, and that's a fair criticism of things past. There have been so many changes and adjustments made in the intelligence process since that time. And again, this was high confidence judgments about what the Russians were doing. And so Mr. Trump takes the intelligence product when it suits his interests, whether it be on North Korea or Syria or other areas, but he seems to be a very selective consumer of information and not just intelligence. And I think that is very, very dangerous because not only does it undermine the confidence of people within the intelligence community, but it undermines the confidence of our allies and partners overseas, because if he's questioning U.S. intelligence, how should they feel about it? So the next time that we go to one of our partners and says, we really need your help on this issue because we have good intelligence that says X, why should they believe Mr. Trump or someone else in the administration after they have denigrated the quality of the intelligence community's work?
Wow.
I don't feel strongly about it.
I can tell, that's why. I'm going to ask you a question that you don't have direct knowledge of now that you're no longer in the agency, and it's more of an FBI matter. So I hope you can just speak as a citizen, an informed one. How long do you think an FBI investigation has been going on, and what would they be looking for other than just pure collusion?
Well, this started out as a counterintelligence investigation as far as what the Russians were doing against our election. And as Mr. Comey has said publicly, they started this last summer, about July. And the FBI does a very, very thorough job of these counterintelligence investigations. I've been closely associated with them in these matters over the course of many years. They will look at relationships, they'll do a lot of interviews, they'll take a look at financial activities and to see whether or not those financial activities might lend insight into who had a relationship with whom.
Wait, you're talking about they would have the financial records if Russia had any financing with the Trump organization?
What I'm saying is that the great FBI agents will pull the threads to see what might be available, either in documentary form or based on interviews of people. And so they build the case because what they're charged to do is to see whether or not criminal activity has taken place. And here now, I see three dimensions to this. One is whether or not collusion took place between Russia and U.S. persons. And that's a fairly high bar, and that's what they're looking at. Second is obstruction of justice. Whether or not in the course of this investigation that there have been individuals who've tried to cover the tracks of anything related to collusion. And the third one is maybe financial irregularities. Whether or not there were some activities that took place that bypassed U.S. laws, regulations, whatever. And so then with the special counsel that has a pretty wide mandate and someone like Bob Mueller who has tremendous experience, as you start to pull those threads on collusion, on obstruction of justice and irregular financial activities, who knows what they're going to come up with, but I think they're going to be doing it very methodically. Bob Mueller is not just starting from scratch when he was appointed. He is able to take the FBI's investigative work over the past year and build upon that. So this is something that I think the American public deserve insight into what actually happened, what the Russians did, and what type of criminal activity, if any, U.S. citizens were involved in.
You mentioned the three areas. What do you think is the most sort of explosive possibilities?
Well, I think any one of them, depending on what type of information, intelligence, and therefore evidence of criminal activity might emerge. And you never know what is out there. I only had insight into some of the things from a foreign intelligence perspective. But again, I give my FBI brothers and sisters great credit for their work. And we'll see now how long this is going to take, whether or not there will be exoneration or some type of inculpatory behavior that's going to be uncovered. I don't know at this point when it's going to happen.
When the Russian hack happened and you knew it happened, and you, I assume, had an array of options, and you picked closing down whatever, or the president picked closing down at PNG. Were there things that you could or could have done, I'm talking in theory here, in Russian infrastructure to give you more control should a president want to pull the trigger?
Well, let me just say that the United States intelligence community, law enforcement community, and military community have tremendous capabilities in the cyber realm, in that digital domain. And they are used to help to protect this country. But you have defensive capabilities and you have offensive capabilities. And I know a lot of people point to the capabilities that the Russians or the Chinese and North Koreans, Iranians, and others have and say, why don't we have those capabilities? Well, I think you, as a U.S. government, we certainly do. It's a question of when and how you exercise them and what you're hoping to trigger or inhibit or prevent by doing that. So I don't want to get into the types of capabilities we have, but they're formidable. and they are ones that we could leverage if we so chose to do it. Now, the question is whether or not we want to engage in the types of activities that our adversaries are engaging in and that we are condemning. Do we want to go down that same path? And it's a question. So to me, I think you want to be able to put together a doctrine that deters, helps to prevent, helps to defend these type of attacks and make it very clear to individuals that we're not going to accept it. But I think there has to be two dimensions to that doctrine. One is the cyber dimension, and then the non-cyber dimension, the asymmetric dimension.
Like sanctions or something.
Like sanctions, even military action.
Yeah.
That should
but
not
let's
be ruled
get
out.
to the cyber offense, which you just talked about. And you mentioned it as a deterrence. Deterrence, it was almost here at the Aspen Strategy Group 40 years ago. They developed a doctrine of deterrence. Part of that doctrine is that the other side has to know what you can do. Is it conceivable you would or could do things where you put code in Russian infrastructure so that they would see it, so they would know?
Well, do you really want me to tell you what
Yes.
capabilities are? Yeah, I'm sure you do. As I said, you can ask me this question many different ways. We have capabilities that we can deploy that would
But I
be
mean, do you
very
want them
effective.
to know?
Well, and you can, rattle the cage. You can do certain things and say, and sort of push them and say, okay, we are going to respond to you. This is just a very limited example of what it is that we can do. But again, going down that path, because some of our adversaries also have capability, and they could throw it against not just the government, the U.S. government, they could go after companies.
Yeah,
And
33,000 electric companies that still use Windows 10.
And then they can take actions against your U.S. citizens in their countries. Now, we should not gauge our reaction to what they could do against us, but that is a consideration. So what we're trying to do is to lead by example and not just by showing just how capable or maybe our cyber capabilities are.
Well, that gets to the very place you began, which is how does this country develop a cyber doctrine, rules of engagement? We took us many years to have strategic arms talks with the Russians to figure out what intermediate range nuclear forces would do if something happened to folks. Are we doing that for cyber?
That policy is evolving. During the Obama administration, we did look at the doctrine and look at the various dimensions of it, and there are multiple dimensions. There's attribution, how confident you are in the forensics in your knowledge about the source of it. And even if the attack emanated from a particular country's sovereign soil, do you know that the leadership of that country authorized it? Or was this something that was just done by some rogue element within that country?
Yeah, that makes it fundamentally different from nuclear. You kind of know if a missile comes,
absolutely.
was probably authorized.
Right, so you punish then the government, but the government in that country may not have had any knowledge of it. Now, we can't give the government a free pass, if these attacks are taking place from their sovereign soil. And that's the point we made to the Chinese many times. You have sovereign responsibility to make sure you police up what's going on in your country. Because if you look at a lot of the attacks that took place over the last decade or so, most of them, in terms of theft of information, whatever, they were emanating from China. And so much takes place from China. But not all of that is done with the direction or authorization of the Chinese leadership or the Chinese military. But still, they have to make sure that they are doing what they can to prevent those types of attacks from taking place. So you have the attribution challenge. You have the consequence threshold challenge as well, in terms of what level do you decide you're going to retaliate. Mm-hmm. The Sony attack by the North Koreans was a destructive attack. They destroyed computer systems and networks there. That's why it generated reaction in terms of sanctions. Now, should that have generated some type of kinetic action against North Korea? Maybe. But you have to think through the second and third order effects of that. So I think, hopefully this administration is continuing to fine-tune what that doctrine should be, what should be the framework in terms of attribution, consequence threshold, and purpose, inhibiting further attacks, deterrence, punitive, retaliatory, or whatever.
We only have 10 minutes left. I want to get to questions of the audience, but getting us away from cyber to raise one more thing. Here this summer, so many scientists from Berkeley, Harvard, MIT, talked about genetic engineering, CRISPR technology. They could make viruses that they could weaponize and knock out an island or a country. As CIA director, when you weren't waking up worrying about the Russians hacking, Did you have to worry about these new forms of technological attacks?
I worried about it as a CIA director, but I also worried about it during my first 4 years of the Obama administration when I was his assistant for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, because the potential for biological agent attacks was something that worried me greatly in terms of how we'd be able to detect it, how we'd be able to prevent the spread, what we'd be able to do as far as countermeasures are concerned, how to get our capabilities in terms of vaccines or antidotes, whatever else that's out there, the distribution systems. And biological agents are one of the things that a lot of the terrorist groups have not seriously pursued. They have looked at it, they have dabbled in it, but they still go for a lot of the kinetic attacks that draw blood. When I think about a successful biological attack, not only the lethality, potential lethality of it, but also the psychological impact that it would have, it is something that I think that we as a country need to be very concerned about.
I see that paddle.
Yes, my name's Larry Gelman, and I wanted to ask you a question. You've detailed some of the things that we could do and sort of drawn up a list of potential options. But given the contempt or disregard, at least, that the president has shown for the opinions and actions of the intelligence community, as a practical matter, do you really believe that the things that the intelligence community thinks might or should come to pass have a chance of coming to pass without more cooperation from and with the president?
Thank you, Larry.
I think it depends on the target. So, for example, if the Iranians were to be responsible for doing something, I don't think the Trump administration would hesitate at all. Maybe the same thing is true as far as North Korea. I think this issue of the current administration or Mr. Trump's position vis-a-vis Russia raises serious questions about what he would be willing to do to be able to demonstrate to Mr. Putin that we are fed up with the actions of the Russians, we're not going to take it anymore, and we're going to take actions against it. And I think there's an obligation on the part of this administration to do that.
Adam Lashinsky with Fortune. You mentioned obstruction of justice, collusion, and financial improprieties. But recently, you've also addressed the subject of treason. Could you discuss that, please?
Well, you know, I was being questioned by the House Intelligence Committee about Russian MO, their intelligence activities, asking me to explain a little bit. And so I've followed the Russians for many, many years. I know they're very good, they're very aggressive, and they're pervasive. And they use a lot of tactics, which is to bring somebody into the tent before they even know that they are interacting with a Russian, much less a Russian intelligence official. And so that's the traditional MO of recruiting individuals. Build trust, build a relationship with them, and you don't even know that what they're after is for you to commit treason against your country. A lot of people recognize that when they're going along the path, but a lot of people are unwitting of it, and they want to help somebody that they may have befriended. They think it's a business contact. They think it's something that is not really going to be damaging to U.S. national security, when in fact it is. So that treasonous path can be very long, and it's one that too many people have been able to have walked down without knowing it until it was either too late. But if you're smart and if you are keeping in mind what your national security responsibilities are, not just as a U.S. official, but as a citizen, you have to say to yourself, wait a minute, time out, and that's when you go to the FBI and say, I think I'm being played by somebody on the behalf of a foreign intelligence service.
Michael Miller, PC Magazine. On another topic, I would like your opinions on encryption. There's been a big discussion as to, many of the tech companies believe that we should have very strong encryption on things. Some governments have said there need to be back doors. What do you think?
I think it's really critically important to have the strongest encryption possible, and the U.S. government, I think, wants that. The Obama administration wanted it. However, it does present a bit of a conundrum in terms of how you're going to carry out the rule of law if you can have tremendous amounts of information and data contained on a mobile device where there is unbreakable encryption that nobody can get into. So even if a judge issues a writ from the bench saying that the government has a right to access this information, just the way they do when they want to get into a bank deposit box or an apartment building or a warehouse, there's no way to do that when you have this encryption that is unbreakable to everybody. And so my concern is I don't want those mobile devices to be safe harbors for terrorists, proliferators, intelligence officers from foreign countries, pedophiles, organized crime, and whatever. So that's where I say, to me, it shouldn't be a question of its security versus privacy. It's how are we going to, in this 21st century, in a digital environment where so much information can be compressed onto a mobile device. How is the government, which has a responsibility to protect its citizens, how is it going to not allow that, again, to be a safe harbor that could lead to our destruction? Because if we don't have security, we're not going to have privacy, civil liberties, or prosperity. And so that's where I tell the technologists as well as the national security professionals, you've got to work harder on this. I don't have the answer to it. But we cannot say we shouldn't have encryption. And a lot of times I think it's a dialogue of the two poles, and they're mischaracterizing the positions of the others. I was told I don't support encryption. That's BS. I certainly do.
David Sanger from the New York Times. Good to see you. I had two questions that came out of your fascinating timeline that you discussed with Walter. The first is that the United States first became aware of the Russian activity inside the DNC in the summer of 2015, the summer before the one where you were particularly alarmed, and that's when the FBI started going to the DNC, and we've all read or heard about the story of their sort of miscommunications for a year. In retrospect, was that a blown opportunity to be able to get at this early? And similarly, since the Russians had been inside the White House unclassified system, the State Department's unclassified system, the Joint Chiefs of Staff unclassified systems, all before the hack of the election, do you believe we underreacted in those cases? And had we reacted more strongly, could we have created some of that deterrence that you just discussed?
On the first one, I don't know if it was a blown up opportunity in terms of the conversation that took place between the FBI and the DNC and DCCC or whatever. I wasn't privy to those conversations. And whether or not we should have acted more aggressively against Russian intrusions into official government networks that we had known about earlier. The cyber realm, the cyber security challenge is one that made my head hurt when I was in the White House as well as at CIA. You know, it's like a water leak. It goes to so many different places. You try to stop the leak, and other leaks develop. And the Russians are, again, very capable, and the use of malware and unclassified systems, and they are very ingenious in terms of all of the different ways that they get people to, open links or attachments or whatever. What more aggressively could we have done? 20/20 hindsight, is always great. I don't believe that anything that we would have done would have stopped the Russians from doing these types of activities. We might have prevented a leak in one area, but if anybody believes that the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or others are going to stop their cyber intrusions into U.S. systems, they're going to continue to do this. And that's where I think the government's role in this cyber realm is critically important, because I think a lot of Americans are quite understandably upset that the government hasn't done more to prevent these attacks, but at the same time, they're not all supportive of more aggressive U.S. actions in that environment. And that's where I think this balance has to take place.
Real quick last question.
Yes. Hi, I'm Heather Bruner with WP Engine. And first off, I just want to say thank you for your tremendous service to our country. It's very inspiring to hear your patriotism and everything you've done for us, so thank you. My question is, as a room full of business leaders, technology leaders, could you give us a call to action? How can we be better stewards, better patriots to protect our democracy as business leaders?
A 30-second call to action.
Okay. To the extent that you can be in contact with your elected representatives, Democrats and Republicans, I am neither, but this partisan environment in Washington is going to undermine this country's security and our future prosperity. We really need to be working. We need to be working together on this, and this cybersecurity issue is not just a government issue. I believe that there really needs to be a call for an independent commission of government and the private sector, along with NGOs and futurists and technologists, whatever, almost like a Manhattan Project. Because I think if there's going to be a solution or a way to proceed, it has to be an unprecedented partnership between the government and the private sectors so that we can make sure that we do as much as possible to protect our information, our data, and that environment. Because if we continue to go this way, and as I said, the dysfunctionality right now in Washington because of political agendas that are overriding national security considerations, I find outrageous. And that's why, to the extent that you, as the individuals who are keeping this country great in the private sector, in the technology and scientific worlds, put pressure on your representatives to put their partisan leanings aside and try to work together more. I have never seen it this bad in my 37 years of work.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the next chair of the U.S. Cybersecurity Commission. He just volunteered. Thank you.